how many well wishes and good lucks and support from friends, family, colleagues are piling up in the group chat. So welcome everyone to this unusual format for a dissertation defense. But I hope that even though we've had delays and we're all struggling to use the technology, this is actually giving a lot of people a chance to share this time with Kristen and hear the responses of her colleagues and friends in the Q&A afterwards than might otherwise have an opportunity to. So there is a silver lining to these things. So how this is going to work is that after I introduce Kristen on behalf of me and her co-advisor, Jeff, she will give a summary, a discussion of the work that she's done as a PhD student at UGA, and some of her closing remarks and thoughts on her other experiences beyond research. And then we will open it up to questions, mostly about her research from the academic community and family and friends. And then after that, we will wrap things up with you all and thank you all for your participation. And then the fun part begins, 3 hours of in-depth questioning, grilling, and otherwise cross-examining our star witness. So you will be able to get back in contact with Kristen after 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we will have finished that part of today's events. You're here for the fun show and tell part, and then we'll carry on doing the rest of it afterwards. So to introduce Kristen, Jeff Heppenstall-Simmerman, who you've heard briefly, and I have been co-advising Kristen for just a year or two, and during her time here. And I actually looked back to read her first emails introducing herself to me, and when she was interested in joining the ICON program. And she very portentously said, as she chose us over Michigan, that she thinks UGA is a better fit for me, especially with the ICON program. I feel like there are great opportunities at UGA to pursue my research interests and take them in new directions, and also push myself academically in the ICON program. And I think that the course of the years of her research and experiences here at UGA, in Mexico, and internationally really show that she fulfilled that vision. Kristen came with a research idea of studying bats in agricultural systems, but with this real interest, which has been an abiding interest in bat conservation. And when she proposed studying a species that migrates thousands of kilometers through deserts at night, I thought, well, what could be easier? But I'm a plant ecologist, and I have the benefit of when I go to study something, it is exactly where I left it last time. And if it isn't, I know what happened to it. But as the research evolved, it turned out that my involvement became as relevant as Jeff's, who is an actual animal spatial ecologist, in that plants ended up being a big part of the story that we'll hear about today. So as the research evolved to go from bats to think about their resources, the people who use those resources also became a deeper and deeper part of her story. And that brought in utilization of social sciences. So her committee, who are all here with us today, include Clint Moore, who's a biometrician who studies how to model the kinds of ecological data that Kristen was collecting, as well as Laura German and Meredith Welch-Devine, who are both anthropologists who are able to provide a whole lot of expertise and guidance on how to study the social dynamics of the system. So what you'll hear about today ranges from using very qualitative interview methods to understand ecosystems as rural Mexican farmers perceive them, to the analysis of data using statistical models. And taking on that work is a real challenge. it's more than one PhD. And hopefully her presentation will give us a taste of the different ways she's learned about the system. As an advisor, it's incredible to watch someone come in who is bats. These are my things. This is what I do. I love bats. And then at the end of the day, spend most of her time actually studying people. And the evolution of the thinking that goes with it is always a spectacular thing to watch, and to facilitate and mentor. And I think the whole committee can say that it's been a pleasure and an exciting journey to watch all of these different ideas deepen and coalesce through Kristen's dissertation. So with that, we will turn it over to Kristen to tell us about what she's done. And I think Jeff will silence us all. If there are any technical difficulties, just sit tight. We have backup and contingency plans. Kristen might switch over to her phone. And if anyone starts having trouble hearing her or having audio problems, you can switch off your video to reduce the bandwidth if you're having trouble with your internet connection. Sometimes that helps be able to receive hers better. I will be monitoring the Zoom chat, so if there's anything that comes up, just let me know. Otherwise, we will let Kristen rip uninterrupted for the next 45 minutes. All right, Kristen?
Can y'all hear me? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming. Like I said, this is kind of a bittersweet moment not to be able to be in person with everyone, but this is fantastic to see everyone here that would not have been able to come otherwise. So thank you all for joining me. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So let me do that real quick. Let's see. Oops. Can you see that yet or not quite? It should be coming up. Can you see that? Thumbs up. Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna, oops. So thank you all for coming. Today I'm gonna be talking about the 6 years that I have been working on this project with the conservation of endangered pollinating bats in Northeast Mexico. And like Lizzie said, this is a very, it evolved from bats to also including a lot of work with people and agaves themselves. So I'm going to give a little overview. So I'm going to give a presentation about the species that we're working with and the conservation challenges that we're facing with this species, the focus and the contribution of the dissertation itself, and then go through the selected findings from each of the 3 chapters that I'll talk about. And then offer some conclusions and some of the work that I've been doing to integrate with conservation practice for this species. So as a little bit of background, the Mexican long-nosed bat, Leptodnicterus nivalis, is an endangered species, endangered in both the US and Mexico and by the IUCN. And this species is a long-distance migrator. So you can see the range in yellow here in orange, and they range from central Mexico and southern Mexico all the way up to northern Mexico and the US Southwest. And every year the females complete this migration from their mating caves in central Mexico to their maternity caves where they give birth to and raise their pups before migrating back down south in the fall. And during this migration, they rely on the nectar of agave plants, shown here. There's these paniculate agaves that have these giant floral rewards through their stalks. And they rely on agave nectar, particularly in the northern portion of their range, where I'm working in Northeast Mexico. Agaves in this region are the sole source of nectar for the species, as far as we know. And with the species conservation, there has been a loss and fragmentation of this agave habitat, which is their foraging area, due to things like agricultural development, residential development, and rangeland for cattle. And so this fragmentation is, and loss of habitat is one of the key threats that's proposed to affect the species. And so conservation efforts for the Mexican long-nosed bat are focusing on augmenting resources of these agaves. So either planting more agaves on the landscape and or increasing the number of agaves that are flowering to provide food for the bats. And this is the target of ongoing conservation efforts. With these endangered species, like Lizzie mentioned, these bats are really difficult to study. They're a rare species to begin with, and they're out at night, they're dispersed over a large landscape, and they migrate. So they're very difficult to study. And this means that there's a lot of uncertainty in the system. There are many key uncertainties, both ecological and social, that we'll talk about and that my dissertation addresses. So with this system, it's kind of a three-part system. We have the bats themselves, we have the agaves that are their food source, and we have people. Because people in the area where I work in Mexico harvest and use agaves for many different purposes. So this social ecological system has many uncertainties, including the relationship between the bats and the agaves. So how are the bats responding to agave foraging resources on the landscape? There's uncertainty about the effects of people's management and uses of agaves on the landscape. And then there's this uncertainty between the bat conservation and the people. There's uncertainty about the social impacts of these proposed bat conservation efforts on the local people where these efforts are being targeted. And in conservation, if we ignore these uncertainties, this can lead to making simplified ecological assumptions that may not actually hold true in the system. And local land uses of local people are often judged against these assumptions. And if we ignore the social context when we design conservation efforts, this can lead to implementation of conservation actions that are detrimental to local people and can be counterproductive to conservation efforts themselves. And so the question then becomes, how can conservation efforts for these bats be implemented in ways that are most ecologically and socially appropriate? And that is the focus of my dissertation. So we have this three-part system again, and each of my chapters addressed one aspect of this system. So the first chapter, chapter 2, is looking at bat foraging at agaves, at flowering agaves, to understand the relationship between flowering agaves on the landscape and the bats' foraging needs. Chapter 3 is looking at the local agave uses and practices in the communities where I worked, and the effects of these practices on individual agaves, agave populations, and flowering of these agaves. And then finally, the last chapter is looking at the local livelihoods of the people and how they're using agaves to enact their livelihoods, to then understand the potential impacts on people's livelihoods of these bat conservation interventions. Ultimately allowing us to identify opportunities to reduce trade-offs and enhance synergies between bat conservation goals and livelihood goals. So this is the map of where I worked in Northeast Mexico. And like I mentioned, this is in the northern portion of the migratory range of the long-nosed bat. And we see two stars here are two of the important caves in the region. Rocio Cave in the yellow is a suspected maternity cave where the moms give birth to their pups. And the purple is Infierno Cave, a confirmed maternity cave. So I worked in 13 different communities spread throughout this region. And again, looking at this, we have chapter 2. So we're going to get into some of the results that we started to find. So again, chapter 2 is the bat foraging dynamics. And the goal was to understand how to design bat conservation actions in ways that are consistent with the bat's foraging behavior. So we looked at what individual agave characteristics and what patch characteristics or local landscape scale characteristics influence bat visitation rates to flowering agaves. So to do this, I used infrared cameras to monitor bat foraging at night. We selected areas that had flowering agaves with different densities, and we monitored 2 to 4 focal agaves with varying densities of conspecifics around them in these 30-meter patches. And we used these infrared cameras with supplemental infrared lights to watch the bats feeding at night. And we typically monitored for about 6 hours per night for 1 to 3 consecutive nights at these clusters of 2 to 4 focal agaves. And we can see here the bats feeding on the agaves, and we can see that there's multiple bats foraging at a time because the species tends to forage in small groups. So this will be important later for our statistical modeling. We counted the number of bats that were in an area foraging so that we could get a per bat visitation rate for our models. So overall, we monitored 688 hours at over 46 nights between May and July 2017 and 2018 at 62 focal agaves. And overall, we recorded a total of 26,128 bat visits. And then when we were in the field, we also measured, did agave surveys to measure those focal agave characteristics and the characteristics of the patch around them. And these are the variables that we monitored and measured. So I'm going to go through each one just to give an idea of what we were measuring. So total umbels, we counted on the focal agave is how many of these flowering groups called umbels are present on the agave. Open umbels is the number of umbels that have any open flowers. You can see the different ones here. Rel pos mid is the relative position of those open umbels. So we set 0 to 1, 0 at the bottom and 1 at the top because these agaves flower sequentially from the bottom to the top. And so at any one time, a handful of umbels are open. And we can see here when the rel pos mid value is lower, that means the open flowers are lower on the stalk and that it's an earlier phenological stage. We also measured slope of the area. And then we also measured in the patch, so these are the patch level variables, the density of open, so the number of stalks with any open umbels in the 30 meters. Density of fuzzy, so this is the old flowers, so any agave that had these old flowers from that season. And then density of dry, so any agave stalks that were dried and still standing from previous years. And then we also had region as a variable. So then we use logistic regression and AICC to evaluate the factors influencing bat visitation rate to focal agaves using zero-inflated Poisson generalized linear mixed models. And like I mentioned before, we used the response variable as visits per bat per hour using an offset term in the model to account for the number of bats we saw at any of the agaves in the cluster on that night and the number of minutes or the hours that we monitored that night. For the zero inflation component of the model, we used cluster as a random effect. So again, cluster is the group of focal agaves monitored on a night, as shown here, the 3 focal agaves in red, and then the blue is the cluster. For the Poisson component modeling bat visitation rate, we used fixed effects for those focal agave and patch level variables, as well as region. And then we used a nested random effect of focal agave within cluster within site to account for the nested design of our sampling design. From these variables, we created a set of 21 candidate models that had various combinations of these variables. We had some models with only focal agave level variables, some with patch level, some with all of them, and we also included an interaction term between the number of open umbels and the position on the stalk, the rel pos mid, and also a quadratic term for rel pos mid, given that Ober and Steidl, 2004, found that this had a quadratic relationship with bat visitation rates when they studied it. So these are all the candidate models. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but just to show you what they look like. And then we ranked these models using AICC to select among the top models. And we used a cumulative weight of 0.95 to select the top models. So you can see here the cutoff of 0.95 is the top 13 models in red. And then from those top 13 models, we model average the parameter estimates and predictions to get our results. So what are we finding? What did we find? So this is a table of the model averaged parameter estimates for each of the variables. And we can see in gray here, the gray variables are variables that were significant with a p value of less than 0.05 in any of those top 13 candidate models. So number of open umbels on the stalk, position of those umbels, density of open agaves in the patch, density of dry agaves in the patch, and the interaction between position and open umbels. However, if we look at the model average parameter estimates and we look at the 95% confidence intervals of them, we see that only the relative position does not overlap 0, which means that there is strong evidence for the effect of the position, but the other variables, there's not as strong of evidence. But I am going to go through each one and show what the relationship did look like. So here we have the number of open umbels on the position on the x-axis and the predicted visits on the y-axis. So again, we see that the agaves with open umbels lower on the plant had higher visitation rates. So agaves that were earlier in their phenological stage had higher visitation rates. Open umbels, again, we have the number of open umbels on the x-axis, and agaves with more open umbels had higher visitation rates, which makes sense because these agaves have more floral rewards, more nectar available to the bats. Now, the interaction between open umbels and rel plasmid was also significant, and we can see that at the bottom, so this left graph here, if the umbels are open at the bottom of the stalk, the number of open umbels has a strong positive effect on visitation rate. We can see that in the graph here. However, if the open umbels are at the top of the stalk, it doesn't really matter how many of the umbels are open because there's not really much of a relationship as shown by that relatively flat line. Density of open, so this is the number of open in the patch, there were higher visitation rates on the focal agave when there were when there were fewer flowering agaves in the patch. But again, there is quite a lot of uncertainty in this parameter estimate, as we can see by these 95% confidence intervals and how wide they are. And then density of dry stalks, we saw higher visitation rates at the focal agave when there were more dead stalks in the patch. So what does this all mean for management and for designing these bat conservation efforts? It appears that both floral rewards, as indicated by the open umbels, and the phenological stage, as indicated by the rel plasmid variable, are important considerations for designing these agave programs. So planting larger agaves is likely to be more beneficial than planting smaller agaves because those larger agaves provide more nectar for the bats. However, some of the larger species that we saw in the area that have more flowers actually complete flowering before the bats arrive in the area during their migration. So this indicates that planting multiple agave species in an area can help ensure that there is nectar availability for the bats, especially with changing climate and with potential changes in the phenology and the timing of bats migration. Now, we observed in the field when we were monitoring the agaves that the bats visit multiple focal agaves or multiple agaves in a patch on a night. And so this suggests that planting agaves in clumps, in clusters, is likely beneficial since the bats are visiting multiple agaves in a patch. And then finally, it appears that bats may be selecting foraging areas with evidence of high food abundance in previous years, as evidenced by those dry, dead standing stalks. And so leaving those dead standing stalks on the landscape could help with these bat agave programs. Now, however, there is definitely some remaining questions to be answered. There's still a lot of uncertainty about those variables, like I showed once we model averaged. So there's still uncertainty in those parameters. And also there's still uncertainty in the population level effects of increasing foraging resources. So we don't really know how many agaves are needed to be planted on the landscape and in what spatial configuration to have some population level impact on the bats. So this is a really important thing moving forward, and adaptive management approaches can help. They can help us understand how the bats respond to different management actions and then adjust those management actions accordingly. So this iterative learning framework is going to be really important moving forward. And also, it's really important that we are transparent and recognize this uncertainty when we're interacting with local communities where these efforts are being targeted. Again, we don't know how this is going to impact bat populations, and so being transparent about that is really important to help us maintain accountability to local people that we're working with. So we have that part, we have the agaves and bats. Now we're going to move to chapter 3, which was looking at the agaves and the people. So the goal was to understand again, how we can design bat conservation actions in ways that are consistent with the agave biology in this area, as well as the local practices of the people. So for this, we were studying those 13 communities, and in these maps here, we can see these 4 communities that were located in these arid areas of the Chihuahuan Desert. And then we have the other 9 communities that were spread throughout the Sierra Madre Oriental Mountains. So it's kind of 2 different diverse communities. And in these communities, they're relatively small, about 30 people to about 700 people in total. So relatively small in rural areas. And their main livelihood activities are farming and livestock husbandry. So these, including using agaves, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And spatially, the community center, so you have this picture here where you can see at the end of this road, there's the community center where typically the houses are located. And then that's surrounded by agricultural fields where people farm things like corn or sorghum or other crops. And then surrounding that is communal land where people are free to graze their livestock or collect agaves and harvest agaves from this communal land. So the research questions for this chapter were, what do people use agaves for? What are they actually making and using agaves for? What agave management and land use practices do people employ? And then how do those practices affect the survival, growth, and reproduction of individual agaves, as well as agave populations, including flowering of agaves? So to do this, we employed an ethno-ecological approach, where we conducted interviews with the people in these local communities. We had, in 2016, preliminary semi-structured interviews, 16, with community leaders and agave experts who had experience harvesting and using agaves. And these interviews focused on the agave uses and land management practices. And then we followed up these semi-structured interviews with more targeted ethno-ecological interviews with those agave experts. So we looked at, and these questions focused on the effects of management practices on the agaves. And to analyze the data, we looked at the interviews and we pulled out causal relationships about the effects of practices on agaves from what people were telling us they saw and they noticed. And then also we combined that with agave ecology and reproductive biology to understand the effects of these practices on the plants. Ultimately, to understand the likely effects of proposed bat conservation interventions and how to design them effectively. So I'm going to go through real quick the uses of agaves in this area, so we have an idea of what they're used for. So agua miel is a beverage that is collected from the agaves, and it's basically the sap of the agave that is collected from the base of the plant. And I'll talk about the practices in a minute. So from agua miel, you can get pulque, which is another drink, and it's fermented agua miel. You can also make mezcal or destilado, so liquor, from the agua miel and the pulque, which is done in some communities. And you can also get agave syrup. So people also boil the agua miel to get this thick syrup. So those are the edible sugar products from the sap. And people can also get edible products from the stalk, that big flowering stalk of the agave, because they cut those and use those and boil them as like a candy. The fresh stalks are also cut down to provide access to the nectar-rich flowers for livestock. As you can see here, the stalk is cut down so the cattle and the goats can feed on them. And finally, livestock also graze on young agaves. So livestock and cattle in particular can kill these young agaves, and they also, cattle and goats, eat the emerging stalks when they're less than a meter high or so. Agaves are also used to support agriculture. So like I said, a lot of these people are harvesting crops, and they plant agaves as living fences around their agricultural plots to protect the crops from animals and from ranging livestock. Agaves are also planted in these agricultural plots on bordos, which are raised soil lines, to retain moisture and soil in these agricultural fields. And finally, agaves are planted along roadways and hill slopes to help control erosion, because they're very large plants, and they do help retain soil. So now, what are the management practices that people are doing to get these products? and how do they affect agaves? So if we look at those agua miel derived products, the practice used to get agua miel is castration of the agave. And we can see the harvester here is what they do is they hollow out the base of the plant. They make a big hole in the base of the plant. And then the agua miel, the sap, then collects in that hole. And then they collect the agua miel over a course of several months. And so some of the traditional ecological thinking that we might fall back on is that this castration would prevent flowering of the stalk because agaves only flower once in their lives and then die. So if you castrate that agave, it won't grow the stalk. And therefore, castration would be bad for agave populations and bat foraging resources. So that's the kind of traditional thinking. But if we look at what we're seeing, we do see that castration does affect and prevent that individual plant from flowering. So it does prevent the stalk from growing. However, things get a little more complicated because some of the agave species in the area produce clonal offshoots, locally called ejos, or children. And we can see those here growing around the mother plant. And this means that the population level effects of castration depends on the species of agave. So for species of agaves that produce few ejos and for which castration does not stimulate production of ejos, then that can lead to declines in agave populations. The castration can. However, for other species, castration actually stimulates production of these clonal offshoots, which has been reported to maintain high levels of these agave populations in some of these areas. So for these species for which castration stimulates the agaves, actually castration helps agave populations. So the implications for this is that castration can actually be compatible with bat conservation goals depending on the species of agave and can be incorporated into bat programs as an important component of these programs. And importantly, for these bat programs, transplantation of these little clonal ejos is one of the methods being used to transplant agaves to different areas. And the castration can therefore provide a source of ejos because it stimulates production of them. And in fact, transplantation of ejos is a common practice in all of the study communities. There's very strong local knowledge of the best practices to transplant ejos. And so the implication for this is that we can build off of the local knowledge to develop successful agave programs so that these agaves that are transplanted grow successfully. Now, what about if we look at the quiotes? So the quiote is used for the candy, the stalks. So again, the traditional thinking is that you cut the stalk. The practice is that it's cut before the flowers open so that there's no floral resources available for the bats. And this is the traditional thinking. And yes, this can be true. So some species that flower when the bats are present in the area, there is a direct trade-off between the bat use of the flowers and people use of the quiote. However, we notice some species, like this one on the left, appear to flower and complete flowering before the bats arrive during their migration in the area, which means in this case, the bats aren't even present when the agave is flowering, so there's no trade-off there in the bat and human use of agaves. So the implication is that, again, this relationship may change with changing climate. Agaves might start flowering at different times, and the bats may be arriving earlier in the season with climate change. And so planting multiple agave species can extend the nectar availability on the landscape for the bats. Now, if we look at the quiotes used for livestock fodder, so these are the ones you cut down, the practice is to fell the stalk to provide access to the flowers. And here we see that the effect on the bat foraging resources depends on the developmental stage of the stalk when it's cut. So this picture here, it's a little hard to tell, but the preference of most of the people we interviewed is to cut the stalk down before the flowers open, so when they're still young and tender. So in that case, that is removing the food resource for the bats. However, some ranchers did say that they cut the flowers or the stalks down after the flowers have opened and after fruits have been produced, in which case there's no trade-off between bat and human use. The bats can still get their nectar and the people can still use the stalk for their livestock. So for this, discussions with the different ranchers who use these two different practices can be important to learn how we could potentially support and encourage cutting down those older stocks versus the younger ones. Now, if we look at free grazing, so livestock grazing directly on the agaves, like I mentioned before, the cattle do eat these young agaves. And in this case, yes, it does kill the young agave. And the cattle and goats both eat those emerging stalks and prevent flowering. And most of the people we interviewed said that there were lower agave populations and lower numbers of agaves flowering in areas with high numbers of livestock. And so in this case, there appears to be a direct trade-off between human use and bat use of these agaves. So when thinking about doing agave restoration for bats, limiting grazing in those areas would increase the agave populations and the flowering for the bats. But again, it's really important to think about the social aspects of this and how people are using these agaves. So where to limit grazing and how to do it in certain ways, it can incorporate people's uses so that it can be done in ways that are not going to negatively impact people's livelihoods. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next chapter. So some of the key takeaways from this chapter is that there are many ecological trade-offs and synergies that we found that depend on things like the specific agave species, the specific practice used, as well as temporal dynamics of the agaves and the bats migration. And local ecological knowledge, so talking to these agave harvesters, can help us scrutinize those underlying ecological assumptions that, if we ignore, might lead to counterproductive conservation efforts. And finally, this allows us to better design conservation interventions that fit with the local social ecological context. So back to our diagram, we just covered chapter 2 and 3, and now we're moving to chapter 4, looking at people's livelihoods and how they're using agaves to then understand opportunities for enhancing synergies and reducing trade-offs between bat conservation goals and livelihood goals. So the research questions were, how do people use agaves to enact their livelihoods? And what are the trends in agave use that we saw in the different communities? And then what are the implications of this for these proposed bat conservation interventions on local livelihoods? So again, we used those interviews between 2016 and 2018. We did 52 total semi-structured interviews. And these interviews focused on agave-related livelihood activities, changes in agave use and livelihoods over time, and what was driving those changes. People's anticipated future use of agaves in the community, and then again, the potential livelihood impacts of those hypothetical bat conservation interventions. And for the analysis, we pulled from those interviews, just like we did before, we pulled those causal relationships identified from the interviews about what was driving agave use, and also the literature on livelihood consequences of conservation policy to look at these potential livelihood impacts of conservation efforts. So some of the results, what we're finding. In 8 of the 13 communities, agave harvest for agua miel has decreased significantly, but is still practiced. And it's to the point where less than about 20% of households in these communities still harvest agaves. And usually it's a lot less than that, less than 10% in most cases. However, it's important to note that the people who still do harvest agaves for agua miel tend to be the elderly harvesters or poorer community members who may not have as many other livelihood options as younger people or people with more livelihood resources. And so this is a quote from one of the elder harvesters that we interviewed. And he said, "And they, young people, are going to win it, the jobs, easier, because if I don't have education, what am I going to do there in the city? So I have to keep on breaking the agaves, gathering firewood, and doing all of that." And so these people see agaves as an important resource to maintain their livelihoods because they may or may not have other livelihood options. And so agaves in these communities are important for subsistence as well as income, especially for these people with limited livelihood options. Now, in one of the communities, agave harvest for mezcal production has remained the primary livelihood activity. And in fact, all 15 families in this community harvest and use agaves to produce mezcal, and they sell it on local and regional markets. And mezcal is in fact an increasingly important livelihood activity as other livelihood activities disappear. For example, when a local mine closed in the area, people lost those jobs and turned to agave and mezcal production as their main livelihood activity. So again, we're seeing that agaves are a very important resource for these people who might not have as many other livelihood options. In 3 of the 13 communities, agave harvest for those sugar products and the quiotes is increasing. And this is for several reasons. One is that agave planting for these products has actually been supported by government programs in these arid communities. The government programs are promoting agaves as a drought-resistant crop and a drought-resistant livelihood activity. So use is increasing. And in these communities, agave harvest is an important livelihood for many people. And this quote, I think, captures it really well. For us in this area where we live, for us, the agave is so noble that it gives us life. And with these uses of agaves, people are harvesting for agua miel and pulque, and also for the quiotes. Even people who don't necessarily do the process themselves or who own agaves are employed by those who do. So agaves are a very important activity and resource in these communities. And agaves were seen by some people as the future of these arid communities and a way to offer new economic opportunities through these government programs. And then finally, in the last community, harvest for human consumable products has essentially disappeared. People no longer harvest agaves for agua miel. And in fact, there was never very high levels of castration for agua miel because the local agave species there doesn't produce very much sugar. However, in this community, agaves remain a critical resource to support people's main livelihood activities, namely livestock husbandry and agriculture. And especially, agaves are especially important in this community for people who rely on livestock husbandry and in times of drought, because agaves are used even more at higher levels in times of drought when natural fodder like grass for the livestock is not available. So in all of these communities, agaves are an important livelihood buffer resource during times of environmental or economic stress. So even if a family doesn't typically harvest agaves, if something happens to their main crops, like an apple orchard, they can rely on agaves. They can harvest agaves and collect agua miel, either for subsistence or to sell locally to support themselves in that tough time. And so agaves allow or provide an opportunity to increase livelihood diversification and increase livelihood resilience to these environmental and economic changes. So then when we think about looking at bat conservation interventions, what are the implications and what are the potential impacts of these interventions? So agave augmentation, so planting more agaves on the landscape, is one of the methods being pursued, one of the strategies. And this provides a very strong compatibility with the current uses of agaves as living fences and on those bordos for agricultural fields. So this is a good opportunity to plant agaves both for bats and people to benefit and support their livelihood activities of agriculture. Now, another of the strategies is to, again, increase the flowering of the agaves through protection of agaves. And this is mainly protection through things like restricting harvest or livestock restrictions. So what if, this is a hypothetical, but what if we wholesale restrict harvest for agua miel or quiotes? What would that do to local livelihoods? So we saw that because people rely on these agaves in different ways, this wholesale ban could reduce people's main livelihood activity in that community that all families harvest agaves for agua miel. It can restrict people's ability to use agaves as a new economic opportunity, and it can restrict their ability to use agaves in those times of economic and environmental stress. And these effects would be disproportionately felt by people who rely on agaves for income and those poorer and elderly individuals with fewer livelihood options. ultimately increasing their livelihood vulnerability to these changing conditions in the environment. Similarly, with the wholesale restriction of livestock grazing, if we say you can't graze your livestock on any agaves anywhere, what would this do? Well, this was stated as a very negative thing by most of the respondents. Many of the respondents said that this would lead to livestock deaths, especially during times of drought when the agaves are an important food source. And again, with the livelihood consequences, this would restrict people's ability to support their livestock, especially during times of drought, and disproportionately affect people who rely on livestock husbandry. And this could also create a perverse incentive to convert agave habitats, that rangeland area, to other land uses such as agriculture that may be more profitable. And also increase the livelihood vulnerability of the local people. So if we think about how can we do these interventions in ways that will still allow foraging resources for the bats, but not harm the local communities and their livelihoods, we actually identified through these interviews some opportunities to mitigate this trade-off. So several of the interview respondents said that creating small livestock exclusion areas, typically less than about 10% of the communal area, could be a great option, because they actually have had numerous government programs that do include fencing off certain areas from livestock. So they already have experience with small exclusion areas. And this would allow those agaves in that area to flower for bats, but still allow people to graze their livestock in the other areas of the communal land. And also several respondents said that establishing these exclusion areas farther from the typical grazing areas is another good option. Typically cattle don't wander too far from where the water tanks are, and so the agaves could be planted farther away where the cattle wouldn't roam normally anyway. So if we look at the key takeaways from this chapter, so understanding local social contexts and the livelihoods of the people where these interventions are being targeted is key. If we ignore these social contexts, it can lead to detrimental effects on people's livelihoods and even counterproductive conservation outcomes, like we saw with the perverse incentive to convert agave habitat. And again, these negative livelihood impacts can be experienced differently by different people in each community. And so understanding this differential impact is important. And we didn't go too much into the details of the benefits of agave programs for bats, but that would be another aspect in which some people may benefit more and some people may benefit less from the programs. So again, that would be another important aspect to consider. So finally, in conclusion, all three of these chapters together, integrating the natural and social sciences and different approaches gives us a better understanding of both the ecological dynamics and the social dynamics of the system, and can help us identify these trade-offs and opportunities for synergy so that we can guide ongoing conservation efforts so that bats and people can continue using agaves into the future. And finally, before I end and open for questions, integrating into practice is another one of the ICON tenets. Our research is not supposed to just be academic. It's supposed to reach out beyond the academia and practice divide. And I've been really lucky and excited to be able to work with different aspects of conservation practice for this bat species. So over the past several years, I've been part of the Nivalis Conservation Network, which is a group of researchers, NGOs, and government agencies from the US and Mexico, working to design and do different research and conservation efforts for the species across its range. And we recently completed the species status assessment revision for the US Fish and Wildlife Service. So that was a big win. And we're currently working to revise the recovery plan for the species. And with my local partners in Mexico, we hosted a pollinating bats symposium where we brought stakeholders together from the northeast part of Mexico, including protected area managers, environmental NGOs, and other academics to teach about pollinating bats and their importance in the ecosystem and to the agaves to local communities. And we also hosted a agave seed collection workshop to provide training on how to collect agave seeds, which can then be used to propagate agaves for these bat conservation programs. So these two efforts are some of the efforts that we've been doing. There's a lot more going on that we're continuing into the future. And I'm excited to say that I will be joining Bat Conservation International in a few weeks for a job to help with their agave restoration initiative for bats. So I'll be able to continue this work and continue providing guidance on the development of these efforts. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone. This has been, like I said, a 6-year-long project, but it's been a passion of mine. And I'd like to thank the ICON program and the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. You know, I've loved being here, and the support that these programs have provided has been truly inspirational and a huge part of my career development. Of course, thank my funders that have supported my fieldwork. And I'd especially like to thank Dr. Jose Juan Flores Maldonado and Dr. Emma Gomez Ruiz for project development and guidance throughout my time. I completed an internship there in Northeast Mexico my first summer, and that was my first time being down there. I was not super well versed in Spanish, and they were gracious enough to host me. And since then, this project developed from that collaboration. And I'm excited to continue working with them. All the field support that I've received, I've had lots of assistance in the field, which I would not have been able to do this project without everyone, so thank you. And then finally, moral support, of course. Tom Preble, my husband, has been here the whole way, supporting everything and providing lots of comfort and encouragement. And of course, my friends and family, everyone, you all know how important you all are to me, and I really couldn't have done this without you. And before I end, I especially want to thank my parents and my grandparents. This is a picture from me in 6th grade when I built bat houses for my Girl Scout Silver Award project, and my mom and dad and grandpa. This has really been a lifelong passion of mine to study bats and pursue bat conservation. And your support has really meant the world to me. I would not be here without you. So thank you all. And I know you're here, so thank you. And with that, I'd like to take any questions.
All right. Well, if people want to sort of pipe up, I think that people are able to unmute themselves, or you can send me a note just saying, I have a question, so that I can call on you by name.
Sure. I have a question.
Uh-oh.
Hello? Hi,
Hey.
Kristen.
Hello.
Hey, so I know your research predated all of this, but I'm wondering if you anticipate any impacts from the local communities with their appetite for conservation due to the negative influences of COVID-19 and the perception of bats overall.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, with the local communities, I have not been down there since COVID arose. But yes, we're seeing that around the world. People are getting kind of afraid of bats even more than before, and those misunderstandings are definitely increasing. And so I think, you know, a lot of what I do as a bat conservationist is education and outreach, and I think that's more important now than ever before. So yeah, I'm hoping it doesn't negatively interfere with what we've been doing, but that's part of the process and part of conservation.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Yeah.
I think Meredith Palmer had a question for you.
I see you, Meredith. Oh, I can't hear you.
Hold on, let's.
You have to unmute. There you go.
There we go.
Can you hear me? First of all, that was amazing. It's so incredible to hear about all of this work that I've known you've been doing for years and years, and just see how that all ties together and to tell this really amazing story. And I think you're out there doing really amazing applied things for this population of bats. And I had 2 questions for you, and they're both about agaves.
Okay.
So my first question relates back to the first chapter that you talked about. And you talked about sort of planting the agaves in clusters together, and you've talked throughout about different kinds of agaves and how they're used at different points in their life cycle. And so I was just sort of wondering, how many agave species are there? Are there some that are more useful to bats than others? Are there some that are more useful to people than others? And then how does the sort of local biodiversity of agave, is it the same throughout your field site?
Yeah, great
So
question.
that was my first question.
I'll do that first, so I don't
Okay.
forget. So yeah, there's over 200 species of agaves in Mexico, throughout the country. So they're all over. The diversity of agave species where I work, it ranges in those communities from one species for the most part to about 5 different species in those mountainous communities. And yeah, I didn't get into all those details about the uses. But there are differences in which agaves people use, because some of those agaves that are the larger species produce more sugar, produce more of that agua miel than other species. So they harvest those instead of the native wild species. And then, yeah, people have brought different agave species to this area because they have higher sugar production. So those communities where they are using agaves and harvesting for agua miel and those quiotes, there tends to be higher diversity in those areas because they've brought those agaves there for that reason. Versus the one arid community that I talked about that doesn't harvest anymore, they only have one species, and it's the native wild species. And it's a lot smaller and doesn't produce much sugar. And so yeah, that, like I said, that has implications for the bats and where they're foraging and which agaves they're foraging on. Does that answer the question?
I see also that you appear to be wearing some form of agave.
I am. Yes, so this is a shirt of one of the infrared videos with the bat and the agaves.
That's incredible.
And I had to have something special for my defense. So there you go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meredith.
Turn it down, but obviously I didn't.
I think, was there, I'm not sure.
I think Teresa had a question.
Yeah, I got one for you, Kristen. First off, really great talk, and
Thank
I'm
you.
really glad my techs were here today so they could all hear about agaves. I'm wondering, as you know, I'm in New Mexico working on Leptonicterus, and I'm wondering in areas where we have really low density agave, like we do out here with very historic cattle ranching industry. Basically, I'm wondering what you would suggest to kind of help with agave restoration. I know Dan's been out here in the area and is thinking about doing some restoration work and doing like plantings, but I was kind of curious with your agua miel work, whether you would actually suggest some other forms of management in the area, but at the same time, we don't want to like limit the number of flowers each year, so.
Yeah, I think it's a very different system up in the US because, it's the protected areas, it's the national parks for the most part in, like in Texas, for example, where the bats are and the agaves. So there's not that human use element as it is in Mexico. But like you said, there is ranching a lot there of cattle. And so again, with those areas, looking at exclusion areas, so certain areas of fenced agaves to protect them from the livestock grazing, I think is going to be important there. And again, because it's not the same social system, there's going to be different relationships with the people. But yeah, I know Dan's been doing a lot of work there, but I think those exclusion areas are going to be important given the context.
Awesome. And I had one more quick question. I was just curious, what made you choose 30 by 30 meter plots for your agave work?
Yeah, so there was a previous study done by Horner, and they used 30 by 30 meters. And also it was a practical issue. Measuring more than that, with the interviews and the night monitoring, just time-wise, couldn't really measure much more than that. So, yeah. Great question.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Give me a second. I'm gonna mute everybody and give you the option because Lizzie's having trouble unmuting. So you just a second. I think Sarah is next. Just a second.
Sounds good.
All right. So everybody's muted. So unmute yourself, Sarah and Kristen.
First of all, great work, Kristen. That was amazing. So great to see everything, coming to a conclusion for this project that you've been working so hard on. Either I missed it at the beginning or I had to get up and grab something, but did you mention anything about this is an endangered bat species, how much the species has been declining over time, and what if there's any projection of sustainability potentially for the species over time with this.
Yeah, so like I said, this is a hard to study species. It's hard to monitor, but the numbers that the endangered status is based on says that within the past 10 to 15 years or so, about a 50% decline in the species number. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty with that number, but there has been, in those caves that are monitored, so where the caves where the bats live, the regular monitoring is seeing fewer bats in these caves. There could be other caves in the areas that we don't know about. There's a lot of ongoing research, but yeah, that's kind of the decline. And then yeah, for sustainability, the foraging resource efforts that are going on are kind of the key thing, and also the roost protection. So there's protecting those caves where the bats are roosting so that they don't get disturbed and don't move somewhere else. So yes, there's ongoing efforts to increase the species, and hopefully, fingers crossed. Thanks.
Okay, someone said, I would like to hear Kristen respond to Jonathan's question, which I did not see. Jonathan, if you have a question, whichever Jonathan it is.
Lizzie, it's a little farther up in the chat.
Oh, there it is. Jonathan Esqueda said, so the density of agaves, isn't that important as the size of the flowers for the number of visits for bats?
Yeah, that's what our evidence suggests. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty in that variable. And with the density of agaves, like I mentioned, if there's more agaves in the patch that are flowering, it makes sense that there's fewer visits at that individual focal agave, because the bats can spread their visits out over multiple agaves. And we observe that with night vision binoculars in the field. They do that. And so that's why planting these agaves in clusters is likely a good practice, instead of just lone agaves spread throughout the landscape. But there is still a lot of uncertainty in those parameters that we measured, and that's why ongoing monitoring and adaptive management will be really important to monitor these conservation efforts. Great question.
We also have a question from Katie Hinman.
Hey, Kristen, excellent work, and I'm totally jealous of your shirt. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about just like the timing. You mentioned these were both, well, one of them was a known maternity colony and the other was a suspected maternity colony. How long are the bats there, and do they have other potential food sources besides agave during the time they're resident in those caves that you know?
Yeah, so I mean, typically the summer is when they're up in these caves where I work. So typically May through August, September. But yeah, the food source that's a great question, because agaves in where I work in Northeast Mexico are the only flowering plant available on the landscape. I mean, there's nothing else. So for nectar resources, it's these agaves that the bats are feeding on. But there's ongoing work that's showing that these bats are eating probably more insects than we previously thought to supplement their diet, if there might not be nectar available. And also it makes sense the protein for the moms to eat the insects. So yeah, it's nectar just from the agaves, but they're also probably eating insects more than we thought.
Okay, Chris Gong had a question.
So Kristen, it was really nice hearing your presentation, and it's very good, and I really love the part that you seem to show that conventional wisdom isn't everything. So you know my research area, so you probably know that what I'm going to ask. So of course, climate change is going to impact all three main subjects of your talk: the plant, the animal, and the humans. So what do you think? There will be short-term impact on the communities, but also on the disease spreading among bats, as well as the plant well-being. For example, I can see if there's less rainfall, the plant could not grow so much flower or grow shorter stalks. And also for conservation of biology in general, is climate change a really big topic, or is it more a niche? It's not an area. I'm really curious. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a great question. Climate change is obviously a big thing, not just for for the agaves, but the people themselves and the bats. And one of the things that the climate change in this area is bringing, or could bring, is increased drought, severity and length of drought occurrences, which again with the livestock can have severe impacts on livestock survival and therefore the people that rely on livestock. And also with the changing climate, the timing of the flowering of those agaves can change. They might flower earlier in the season or later if there's less rain, for example. And the bats also might be migrating at different times. And so that's the concern, is that with changing climate, the overlap between the bats and the agaves, both temporally and spatially, as ranges might change, that overlap could change. And so that's kind of the big concern. And that's why I think planting a mix of agaves in each area, a mix of agaves that are currently locally adapted to the area, to the current conditions, and then also thinking ahead of what the future conditions might be and planting some of those agaves that are adapted to those conditions. It's a long-term thing, and it's hard to kind of think that far ahead, but that is, I think, a good strategy to hopefully mitigate those overlap issues. Great question. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, great answer.
John Mears has a question.
Kristen, wonderful job. So I was really kind of intrigued in your first chapter about why it was difficult to find such a strong relationship between some of the resources and the bat foraging, and was thinking about some of the things theoretically that we know influences those kind of relationships. And I'm curious what you think would be some other variables that you weren't able to address that really might have overwhelmed or made it difficult to measure the response of the bats to kind of some of the parameters that you did measure.
Yeah, so the variables that we measured were variables that we have had evidence for in other studies, for example, that showed like the position on the stalk, the number of open umbels, density, but that density, for example, is only within 30 meters. So it's not a very large spatial scale extent. And so I think because these bats can fly 50 kilometers one way in a night to forage from their roosting cave, there's a lot of spatial variability and spatial dynamics that we didn't capture in these models. And so I think looking at things like agent-based modeling, or to look at the individual movements along that greater extent, would be really useful, because we were only at a very small spatial extent. And I think energetics too, there have been some energetic studies done on these bats to see how much energy they're expending when they're flying and how much nectar they need to account for that. That would also be important to look at the spatial variability and the spatial arrangement of these agaves on the landscape, right? We only looked at agaves in a 30-meter patch, but the way you arrange those agaves on the landscape can have implications for how far the bats have to travel to feed, and therefore their energetics and possibly their survival. So I think including that too would be important for future studies.
I can't remember, but did you have distance that they had traveled to the patch as a variable?
No, I did not. So we do have those 2 known roosting caves, but there are likely other roosting caves in the area. And given the size of the data set, we didn't have more room to parameterize more parameters. But yes, distance to roost would also be good to include.
Yeah, because from foraging models, that travel time is supposed to connect to how long an animal tries to use or exploit resources from a patch. And right. It was the first one that jumped to my mind as being something that might be interesting to know.
Yeah, that's a great question. So with some of the previous studies of bat foraging, these bats will leave a cave, they leave their day roost and fly, and they usually fly like quite a far distance, 20 kilometers or so, and forage at agaves in that area. And they have night roosts. So these night roosts are used throughout the night as temporary resting spots that the bats will rest in and then go forage again. And then they'll return to the actual cave for the day. And they can return to the cave throughout the night. So it's not just that central roosting cave, it's also these other night roosts, which complicates things because we don't know where those night roosts are really, which would be good to learn.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, we have a question from Grandpa.
Are you there, Grandpa?
Okay, I see you.
Ah,
I understood early
right.
on that you said that the females are the ones that do the migration.
Mm-hmm.
Do the females reproduce more productively than the males? Because they surely all cannot survive an extended flight like that. So is the ratio of male to female pretty equal to start with, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the female, there's a lot of reasons why the females might migrate. Like you said, competition for food resources in those areas might drive some of the bats to migrate. And I'm not sure about the ratio of the sex ratio, but yeah, the females are migrating, and it could be because there's too much competition for food in certain areas, so they migrate out of those areas. And they don't actually they don't fly with their pup. So they fly up north, and then they give birth to their pup in the northern part of the range.
Okay.
And then they fly back a couple months later with their pup, but the pup's flying by that time. That makes sense.
Okay, well, thank you. Who would have thought that it all wound up with this, just starting with the design and building and installing of a few bat houses?
I know, right? Yeah, it's been a
time was had by all.
Yep. And thank you for all your help with those bat houses.
We have one more question from Liz Braun.
Hey, Kristen, congratulations. You did awesome. It's so exciting to hear your work. So it sounds like timing is pretty important in terms of harvesting and when to fill those stocks, either for the quiotes or for cattle forage. And then it kind of ties back into your first chapter where those lower flowers that, as I understood it, were blooming first, were seemingly more important for bat visitation rates rather than the overall number of umbels or the later blooming ones. Can you just explain that a little bit more? Are those lower flowers, do they have greater nectar production by chance, or are the bats happening to be migrating through during that time when those are flowering first?
Yeah, we don't know exactly. So with these agaves in this study area, there's not a lot known about these agaves. There's a lot more work done on agaves in central Mexico. There's a lot higher diversity there, and there's been a lot more studies done. But in Northeast Mexico, there haven't been a lot of studies done on these agaves. So things like nectar production, nectar sugar concentration, we don't really know. And so yes, it could be that there's more nectar or higher concentration, sugar concentration of nectar at the lower flowers, because that would make sense, because by the time the flowers open at the top, that plant has expended a lot of the sugar energy to produce those other flowers. So yes, it could be that. And yeah, it could also be that the bats are just more present in the area when there's those flowering at the bottom. But we did monitor, there was a mix of the umbels that were open at the top throughout the season. It wasn't just later in the season. So might not be that.
So that's really cool, that finding and potential management implications, right? Because I think you had mentioned that you know, some of the ranchers are felling those stalks after a lot of the blooms have already, so like once they're up higher. So if you could encourage that more in recommendations, it seems like that would be, you know, a somewhat simple action for them to take.
Absolutely. And that's why, you know, having those conversations with people about why they harvest, why some of them harvest the unopened flowers and why some of them wait would be really important. because, like, for example, one of the people that said that they harvest the ones that had produced seeds and produced fruits said that it takes fewer quiotes. They have to fell fewer because those fruits have more, they fill up the livestock faster. They're more filling. And so it's actually less effort for the person to harvest because they have to harvest fewer if they're older. So yeah, having those conversations between the people could help encourage that practice.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have gone through a whole bunch of questions and gotten to hear Kristen's talk and responses. I want to thank everyone for participating and making this such a successful meeting to have, despite the format and the delays. I think the committee probably would like 5 or 10 minutes to go get a cup of coffee and a snack before the next session. We'll leave the meeting open if people want to congratulate Kristen for a minute, but she probably needs to take a quick break too before we dive into our next session. So we can give her a virtual round of applause. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you for
And we will see you all in a bit.
Take a deep breath, Kristen. Go refresh yourself and move on to the next part.
Oh yes, I will. Bye, Ryan. Bye. Well, thank you, everyone. It was so great to have you all here.
Bye. Thanks for having us.
Bye, guys.
Good luck.
All right. We're
Good luck.
Bye. Bye, Ryan. Bye, Colin. Bye, Chris. Oh, Meredith. Morgan. Oh,
bye, Sissy.
thank you.
Close it.
Bye, I'll talk to you later.
Here, close this out and hit this.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Okay, so you get out of it. Are you
It
there
should be at
still?
the bottom. I'll leave at the bottom right.
Yeah.
A little.
We got it. Cindy was down
Okay.
there with the bar across the bottom.
Cool. Well, I'll call you guys later.
Okay.
Okay, good luck this afternoon. So.
And yeah, we're going to be at Ryan's baseball game from 6 until probably be home at 8:30 or 9. So
right.
We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Love you guys.
Love you too. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Bye,
Good
Sissy.
luck. Bye.
Aw. Did you get out or are we still in?
I like all these people hanging around. Tom, I see you.